Don't do lots of brush strokes. Less brush strokes, smoother actual contact with the model, less friction will give you a smoother finish.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how to improve your miniature painting.
We've got some really great models to look at this week, so let's jump in and have a look.
Coffin is back, who says, "Hi guys, thanks for the feedback on my apothecary. I try to incorporate it and the blending from the Emperor's Children video on this librarian, and I'd love to hear what you think." So just as a quick refresher for us, this was the previous submission to Critique Clinic, and we gave them some feedback on particularly the glazing and the smoothness of the transition. We noticed that there was a lot of sort of brush marks around here, particularly at the bottom of the shoulder pad. We was giving them some feedback on improving their glazing. It's also visible here on the side of the leg panels.
Well, what an improvement from the previous submission. I think you've done a tremendous job, and I really like the fact that you have taken a lot of the tips in the Emperor's Children video on our channel that George done and incorporated them into this miniature. I think jumping straight in, I think you've done a great job with like the attention to detail across the model, the way that like the light is shifting on the tabard and the cape. I think we really liked that on the previous submission as well, and I think it marries on this one. You've done a really good job with adding that kind of like cloaking effect, which I think is awesome. The script on the Purity Seal and Parchment looks fantastic. Really, really believably looks like text, which I think is great. I think for me, the biggest thing that I want to comment on is a thing that I talk about a lot on the Critique Clinic, which is the leather. I think you've edged it in a very similar way to the rest of the armor, and it doesn't really read as leather. Very, very similar to other entries that we're going to be talking about, or that we've spoken about on here. I think that you just need to look at real life reference for leather and incorporate the way that that looks onto the miniature. Again, your job is to make those details believable as leather. And I think trying to paint it as close as possible to realistic leather will help you massively.
Yeah, one more thing I wanted to comment on as well is just sort of a finish. I think for me, particularly on black details, this looks like really, really matte to me. I'm not sure if you've put an ultra matte varnish over the top of this or not, but I think that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I actually prefer a bit more of a satin finish because I think particularly for darker colors like black, I think it actually has a lot more depth to have more of a satin finish, something with a little bit more of a sheen to it. That's something just to consider. I think in this episode, we're going to be talking about ways to go about doing that rather than spray varnishing the whole thing. And basically just applying it with a brush. So anything you'd use for the airbrush, or you can also buy just brush varnishes as well. Just chuck them on the wet palette, thin them down a little bit, and just brush over some of those areas. I think for me, that would make the black look a little bit more deep and natural without actually having to really alter your painting in any meaningful way.
So the final thing to chat about is the blade. You mentioned obviously doing a bit of non-metallic metal on there. And I really want to give you props for putting the effort in and doing that on the model. I think one of the things that I would definitely comment on is just the sort of transitions. I think non-metallics, they do have quite harsh highlights on them, definitely. I think one of the things that this does demonstrate is that you've got some really nice kind of like segmented areas of different tones on the blade, which is good. I think one thing that I would possibly recommend is just to soften it a little bit and smooth it. Even though they are harsh, the transitions, as in the striations on a metallic object, they still have a softness to them as well because of just the polish or the sheen on the surface. So I think any little lines and things that you've got on there, just try and soften those a little bit more. You can make the areas of color quite harsh in their tone and visibility, but I would also just soften the joins just to make it flow quite nicely.
It'd be quite similar to the way that you did the glazing, like picking up from that Emperor's Children tutorial video 100%. As well, which you've applied really nicely to the green armor on here. Just the same thought process behind that in terms of getting that smooth transition. Definitely. One thing I would say as well that might help you out a little bit is just to add a tiny little bit of color and tone into that blade as well, to help kind of sell that it's got some reflections. Obviously, the miniature's in a sort of green environment, so just adding a really, really subtle green tint to that as well, I think could really help.
100%, yeah. So lovely sort of little reflections on there, and absorbing metal, when polished metal absorbs the tones and environment around it. So you have those lovely secondary reflections, which are just things that are in the general environment. So yeah, so I'd recommend taking that into consideration, as George mentioned.
Yeah, but otherwise a really great attempt there, and it's lovely to see the improvement from the first miniature. So fantastic on that, and we look forward to seeing what we do on the next one. Pepper Paints Plastic says, "Hi guys, just finished up my first batch of Sanguinary Guard. Wondering how I could add more interest and improve the golden armor, seeing as I have 9 of these guys to get through. Any tips on how best to varnish models where you want different finishes? I used a satin varnish on these, but I feel the loincloths and tactical rocks are a bit too shiny."
I'm going to try and mitigate my bias as much as possible on this one. I think you've done a really good job. It's neat. It looks smooth. It looks like you've really put a lot of attention and care into the model with the painting. There are a couple of little things that I want to comment on. We can talk about the gold, which I'll just finish off with in a bit. The first thing, however, is that there is a mold line on the front leg. So if we just look here, you'll see that there's a mold line running up the whole entire toe, the upper foot armor, and then up the shin on the knee pad, and you can see it following up the leg. It's really important during the cleanup stage to look out for these things, and which is why I also recommend having a fresh eye break once you've built and cleaned your models before you get all excited and get paint on them. Make yourself a cup of tea, take a couple of minutes, look at something else that's not the models you've been staring at for hours, and then just look at them again quickly before you paint them, just to catch these things. So yeah, regarding the gold, I've painted a fair bit of gold on Blood Angels, so I think I've got the merit here to be able to help you. I think the gold's done really nicely. It's really nice and rich, which is great. I think to add more interest to it, I would potentially start looking at glazing sort of some of the shapes, volumes, to add a little bit of tonal variance on, like, for example, the ablative armor or the abs, the upper chest. You can start basically adding some shadows across them. And what you can see here as well is that if the photo you've taken, you could literally convert that into black and white, and then you could start placing some of the shadows where the actual shadows are on the model. So you could use that black and white photo as a little bit of a map if you're unsure where to actually place the shadows and leave the highlights or boost the highlights. You could use that photo in black and white to kind of help you. Obviously, that is totally dependent on where you place the light on the model and the angle that the light is hitting the model. But just maybe take a couple of photos with the light from different angles, see what looks most interesting to you, or what sort of tickles your fancy, and then I'd start adding a bit of glazing onto there just to add a bit of tonal variance. And you can do that with with inks, like a watered down ink, or you can do that with even just normal sort of like browns and darker paints that on the gold. Shadows obviously are matte typically, even on golden armor and stuff like that. Shadows don't really reflect light, so what I would definitely recommend is maybe using some more matte colors, or just normal acrylics as well. That works quite nicely. The other thing I'll give you another option as well is that you can use, for example, shade paints as well. You can use those and just add them, thin them down a little bit, obviously make a glaze out of those and then work with those. You can use things like Reikland Flesh Shade, and you can just thin them down to a glaze. That lovely rich reddish tone would work quite nicely on the gold. Or you can use something like Druchii Violet as well. Purple works quite nicely on the gold as well when you thin that down to a glaze and use colors like that. Just adds a little bit of interest, shows kind of like reflections from things around in the environment as well. So that's probably what I'd recommend that you do.
Yeah. In regards to varnish, which was one of your questions, I think people sometimes forget that you can go back in and just brush varnish.
Yeah.
So what I would actually advise is for the spray varnish, do whatever finish you want predominantly on most of the model. So in this case, most of the model is the metallic, so you're going to want that like satin, slightly reflective finish on it. And then if there are any areas you want to be matte, like the cloth, for example, or the basing, I would just get your matte varnish, put it on the palette, even if it's designed for airbrush, it's absolutely fine. Just put it on your wet palette and then thin it down with a brush if required, and then just brush it on carefully, thin layers like you would with any other acrylic paint, and then just let that dry on there, and that would just leave you a nice matte finish in the areas that you want it. But otherwise, yeah, I agree with all of James's feedback as well. Really cool model, and we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Amy says, painted these as a pair for part of my Troll Horde army for this quarter, all focused on working on better skin layering. I'm one of those people who enjoy doing an army to learn one technique better, but very much in a painting rut.
So this is a really awesome piece, Amy. I think you've done a great job on it. I love the use of the vibrant colors and then like the framing of it with the neutral tones and the colors, which just really sort of like don't take away from the actual miniature, which is really good. I think the rock really looks like rock, which is good. I think you've done a great job on that. It looks like there's a little bit of texture on there potentially, and that could have been from dry brushing, or it could be maybe a little bit of from the undercoat or from the spray. It could be a little bit of texture from that potentially. I think the biggest bit of feedback that we had when we looked at it was that the skin, I know you put a lot of colors and interest into it, which is really great. I think the face really gets lost. It kind of like blurs into the piece quite massively. I think one of the things to really concentrate on is, as faces on anything, irrelevant of it being human, alien or whatever, faces are like the focal point of a miniature where your eye is trained to read and understand and see a face immediately. I would really recommend that you spend extra attention and maybe even highlight more so the head. Yeah. It kind of gets a little bit lost on the piece.
I think it's a little bit of a contrast thing, really, because even though it might not be like necessarily like correct to light or whatnot. I think that maybe just adding some extra highlights and making it just a little bit brighter than the surrounding skin might help, because especially where you've got similar tones. So like you've got all the boils and stuff on the shoulder, but that's the same colors that's been used for like the nose and parts of the side of the face. So maybe potentially like using just some slightly different shades for that around the face might help kind of draw the eye as well.
Definitely, yeah, 100%. But I think overall, really, really lovely piece. I think there's lots of real nice, interesting details in there. You've got some really nice, vibrant colours, nice colour combos. Obviously, the blue and the orange contrast in that works really good, and the subtle green tones with the magenta. I think, yeah, just really overall great colour choice. Great sort of like additional details, like for example the bushes and things on top of the rock and all those kind of things. I think you really added a lot of interest to it. But yeah, I think in general the face gets a little bit lost for me.
Yeah, I think that'll be my main point of feedback. But otherwise, it's really nicely painted. Like everything's blocked out really nicely. I love the vibrant colours. I think the interest is all there. Like we said about like in the small additional details like the tufts and stuff on top of the rock. Yeah, I think my main gripe would be, like James said, it's just that little bit of texture on the rock, which to me looks a bit more like a mistake than it does like intentional texture.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure what's caused that. It might be a bit of overspray, that looks like to me potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
Or maybe where you've just like gone over it with some different colors, but that's just something to watch out for. And then, yeah, if we could draw some more detail and attention towards the face, I think that would make it stand out a little bit more and pop a bit more. But otherwise, it's a really nice model. So thank you for submitting. We look forward to seeing what you paint next. John Chanel says, this is my first request here, so I'm looking for any specific areas you can see where I'd be able to improve my painting. I'm quite time limited, so if there's anything with a good return on time investment, I'd love to hear about that. Overall, I think this is actually a really, really nice miniature. There's a lot of attention to detail that's gone into this, like with the script on the parchment and the purity seals. Everything's blocked in really nice and neatly, and I think there's a really cool, like, overall menacing kind of theme with that dark overall color, but there's still a little bit of tonal variance, like you've got with the sort of leather straps and the pouch. Is a bit different to the sort of leather cape, is different to the black power armor. So I think there's a nice bit of like variation and interest in there 100%. Without like detracting from it having like a dark and menacing sort of overall tone.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there are a couple of little nitpicks that we're going to go into here just to help you kind of push it a bit further along. And in response to your comment, I think these are quite quick things to do that will have a really big impact overall. So my first thing would be the leather grip on the Croziers here. I think it looks a little bit flat to me. I think you might have used a wash on this, but potentially where the model is upright, gravity has kind of pulled that down.
Can see that,
so I can see that towards the bottom, it's a lot darker, and you can see more shading in all of the recesses between those little diamond-shaped segments. But if we're looking at the top here, I can't really see much of that. So my advice would be, when you're using washes and things, just think about gravity and how the model is drying, because that can sometimes cause some pooling. So what you could potentially do is just lay the model flat while that dries. Or if you have got one handy, just a small like travel hairdryer is quite handy to have at your painting desk, just to quickly dry areas like that so that you can move on. That would be something to watch out for me.
The other thing I was going to say about that is also be conscious of how much material you're actually putting onto the surface of the object. If you put so much on that gravity affects it and it pulls it to the bottom, that's too much. And that's just something to be conscious of when you're putting those layers on. Just make sure you're not flooding the area and it is just a thin skim of that color or tone. So yeah, I think what I wanted to sort of like go into detail about is actually the thing you spoke about. It's a very menacing model, which is great. And I think you've used really appropriate tones and used brighter colors to define details, which looks great on the model. One of the things I would like to comment on is the leather. I don't think it reads as leather, especially when you've got the big overcoat with the hood and everything, which is either leather or material, whatever you choose it to be. I think the material in general looks a bit flat. I think that you need to just add some slight difference of tones on that. Remember, with material, it's about if it's flat or angled. That depends the vibrancy of it. It's not whether it's high or deep. That's irrelevant to the tone of the material. Purely, if it's flat to light or flatter to light, it is brighter. If it is angled away from light, it is darker. So that is what I would like to see on this. I think there are some bits that are flatter that would catch the light more, which you can slightly improve, like brighten. And obviously, it just makes it read a bit more like a different material to the power armor. When we look at the leg and we look at the two bits of material either side of it, or the leather, whatever it is, either side of it, they look as flat or as the same material. It doesn't really read as two different things.
They've been highlighted and painted in a very similar way.
Exactly, yeah. Touching more upon the leather, again, I always say this, your job as a painter is to deceive the eye of the viewer, to make someone believe it's not a plastic miniature and make them believe it's either leather, cloth, material, bone, metal, all those kind of things. So I really would implore you to look at, like, just type in on Google, like, leather gun holster and look at like a weathered one and look at where on that holster you would find like scratches, little nicks, details, things like that. I can see you put like a few little ones on there, but it still just looks like a really thick edge highlight on there. And I would really implore you to try and just take some real life reference of leather gun holsters and just paint what you see. Same as the belt and the strap, obviously for the holster. That's leather as well. You've painted it the same, so it reads the same as the rest of it. I'd go in there and put some more details on there, little nicks, scratches, little marks, to show that sort of like abrasion and all those things. That leather, it's a really interesting material. It develops its own personality through friction, through contact, through use. So you want to tell that story and tell that narrative of that and that history of that piece of leather on the model. And again, I'm being really granular with the feedback on this, but I know you asked about things to make things a bit more efficient or quicker.
Well, in terms of a fairly practical way to approach doing that and fairly quick as well, I would, before you do this, like edge highlight, for example, I would go in with like an old, a bit tattered brush and just stipple on there some texture, like almost like dry brushing, but with like a round brush.
Yeah.
And be more subtle with it. So like the color choice, don't have a massive jump in contrast there, and experiment with a little bit more like saturated tones as well, like oranges and things like that.
Yeah.
Get some texture on there, like quick and easy. It's going to look quite subtle because you're going to do it fairly similar to the base coat color. Then go in and do that highlight afterwards. That'll add some extra visual interest.
100%.
You could do the same if you're trying to make this sort of cape reader's leather as well. You could do a similar sort of thing there and just sort of pay attention to lighting, as James said earlier.
100%, yeah. But overall, really, really great miniature. It's a really nice model, so I think you've done a great job.
Yeah, 100%. We look forward to seeing what you paint next. Hoffman says, this is my most recent finished project and one I'm the most happy with the end result. Although this project is finished, I'd love to take on any advice you have for improvements on this piece so I can incorporate it into the next project.
Hoffman, you got a lot of mood on this one. I think it's a good miniature. Really, really well done. I think there's a couple of things, and again, I think these are more opinionated because the style that you're painting in is really atmospheric, which I think is great. So I'm going to give feedback on this in a purely opinionated basis because I think what you've done is great. I think the skin could be a bit smoother, and I think with some glazing, just some of the harsher highlights they could still be as bright as that, but I think that you could have a bit of a softer transition between where the shadow is to the mid to the light. I think you could just soften that slightly. Now again, that's just purely opinionated because if this is like more of an atmospheric kind of thing, piece that you're going for, the harshness of the highlighting works really, really well. I don't think there's anything negative about that at all whatsoever. I will, however, say that I think the brush work in actually painting the highlights on, I think you can be a bit smoother with the actual application of it. Don't do lots of brush strokes. Less brush strokes, smoother actual contact with the model, less friction will give you a smoother finish.
Yeah, I do think there's like a little bit of texture you can see from... It's very subtle, to be fair.
Yeah.
It's not a lot, but...
it kind of works with the piece because of the atmospheric look, and it also works with the piece because it's like a Nurgle model, so like he wouldn't have like, he's not sponsored by like L'Oreal for like for skincare, do you know what I mean? So yeah, I would probably recommend just in general, just smoother brush strokes. The other thing that I was going to comment on was actually the axe.
Yeah, I was going to go there as well.
Yeah. The axe looks good. Like I get that it's rusty and that's cool, but I think you need to look at real life reference for rust, and I think you need to like add varied tones of oranges and stuff on there.
It's very much like one kind of brown tone overall, and I would like to see like some stippling of some like more saturated oranges.
Yeah, definitely.
A little bit more variation on there, especially because it's quite large, the axe.
Yeah, and you've got all like the little pock marks where the rust has eaten away at the metal. You've got those little holes and divots and marks, and what you probably want to do is focus brightness into those to show that where moisture's collecting or any blood at the end of the day has got water in it. It's that's part of what's in there. I don't know why we're getting technical on blood, but that would create corrosion over the surface over time, and you kind of want to focus that in some of the recessed areas. The last thing I'd probably do as well is like where he's maybe hit other armor of other models and stuff like that, do some like silver chips on some of the edges and just a couple of little scratches and nicks and stuff, and that'll give you a lot of tonal variance on there and add interest to it more, I think.
You would expect that edges are going to get worn, so any rust that has built up over that edge is going to very, very quickly wear off. Yeah. So I would go in and do like almost like an edge highlight or a dry brush or something, just with a silver.
You could almost like stipple along the edge as well, just to like literally just break up the edge and just show that some nicks and sort of like where the metal has been ripped open a little bit on the edge or something like that. Now I've got to say the other thing I wanted to comment on was the mucus. I don't know why I'm making such a big point of it, but it's very bright, which is good. It draws the eye, and I'd probably say it draws the eye more so than the highlighting that you've done on the head. It's like it almost through no fault of its own. I don't know whether this is intentional or not, but it almost looks like it's glowing a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is nothing wrong with that at all whatsoever. I just think that like
it's a little bit of a, for me, I think it's a little bit of a distraction.
Yeah, exactly.
In an area of the model that
the center mass.
I'm a little bit confused as to why attention is being brought here over anywhere else. I don't think that this is inherently wrong. I think the issue is that because the head is overall quite dark, where you've got that spot highlight kind of on the front.
Yep.
Which, not to get too technical and nitty gritty here, but I feel like this highlight should actually be further up the head anyway, because that kind of implies to me that the light's being projected from front
directly
onwards.
in frontwards. Yeah, and if light's coming from above, then yeah, and if you in the way that the sort of stomach and like the top of the arm and all that would insinuate that light's coming from more of above than directly in front. I think as I said, like there's nothing wrong factually with it. If you want to make the mucus glow and have like this eerie kind of look to it, that's really cool and I like it. Definitely, I think it's very in keeping with the mood of the piece. I just think, like I would try and maybe brighten the head a little bit, or just desaturate it down. Because it's green, you've got all that red around it anyway. That mucus, you're going to have a really high contrast look to it anyway. Same with the boil. I think we were talking about the boil as well. Like you could highlight that a little bit more, put a brighter yellow in there. Or if you really want to do something cool, you could paint it maybe as like a yellow eye or something like that. That would look quite cool. Put a pupil in it or something. That would be quite cool. But yeah, in general, I think the model's really good. I think that you've chosen to do really bright highlighting on some of the edges, like the shoulder plate as well. I think that maybe potentially is a little bit too bright potentially. I think
I do think though it is just like a little bit of inconsistency with lighting, because you've got the way the skin and the legs have been highlighted very much implies a top-down light, but the way the shoulder pad and the helmet have been highlighted implies light coming from the front.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's just a little bit of inconsistency there. We're nitpicking now, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, it is a really lovely piece.
It's great. It's really cool. Yeah,
it's very stylized as well. So I would take all of that with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Yeah, that's why we caveated it with opinionated. There's nothing factually on the model that I think you've done like badly. The only thing I think we could say is just maybe just be a bit more careful with your brush strokes when you're painting the skin to get it a bit smoother. But if you want the skin rougher because it's Nurgle, then what you've done is great. So yeah.
Yeah, really cool piece. Thank you for submitting. We look forward to seeing what you do next. Zabriel Lamech has painted a Death Guard Lord of Poxes.
So for 5 months painting, I think you've done a really good job. There's some really, really cool things on here. I think it shows that you've got a good eye for detail and also a good eye for sort of like choosing colours. The purple is great, by the way. Works really well with the green. Contrasts really nicely to the red little details like the lenses and the end of the sword, which I think you've done great. I think the biggest thing for me when looking at the model is that there is definitely a paint thickness issue on the model. Like there are some areas where the paint, you can see obviously texture, which is obviously built up through number one through just applying quite a considerable amount of paint to the surface of the miniature. I think it's just something to be conscious of. Like when using your paints, you do need to learn as best as possible the behavioural characteristics of them, the dilution scope, so you can sort of decide how much you want to dilute that paint to get the perfect opaque covering when you're layering it on there. I'd also recommend, we talk about it quite a lot, but I'd also recommend you use like a travel hairdryer or a small hairdryer just to fix the paint in place when you apply it on and really pull that paint tight and smooth it across the surface of the model, definitely. As I said, for 5 months painting, you've done a really, really great job. And I think the fact you've picked Nurgle or Death Guard as the faction for this and where you're at as a painter, it actually, the style that you're painting and the way you're painting complements those models quite nicely, because you've got a little bit more free reign to be a bit, I don't want to say messy, but you've got a little bit of free reign to be a little bit more experimental on them, because it kind of works with Nurgle models, I think. That's my biggest thing on this from looking at it. I do think that I will say this, I always talk about leather. I think you've actually done a really good job on the leather and making it look a bit like it's old, really worn leather. The only thing I would comment on that is that there are some little studs and things holding some of the leather pieces together. Where you've painted metal, paint those little studs, because then it just shows that they're not leather, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think in general, just thin your paint a bit more, spend a bit more time with actually applying that paint and learning your paint thickness to get it just smooth, but also solid opacity.
Yeah, just to extrapolate on what James is saying about thinning the paint as well, it's about applying thinning down the paint with water, either on a dry palette or a wet palette, and then applying it in thin layers as well. And then most importantly, this is where I see a lot of people going wrong, is overworking the paint. And what I mean by that is once you've brushed it onto the model, you need to leave it before it's like dried completely. So if it has any sort of like a satiny or slightly glossy, wet looking finish, do not brush over it again, because while the paint is curing, if you brush over it again, you're going to create lots of texture, because you're going to basically disintegrate the paint and break it up into little crumbs
Yeah, exactly.
while it's drying. And then you're adding another layer of paint on top and then setting it in place, almost acting like a glue. That's why you start to get some of that texture on there. So what James is saying with the hairdryer is thin the paint down with a little bit of water, or a considerable amount of water if required. Add a nice thin layer on there and then leave it. Dry it if you need to with a hairdryer so that it speeds up the process. And then only after that, go over it again. That should help get a lot more smoother finish of the paint and hopefully improve that overall look and smoothness.
Definitely, yeah. And I do think just tack onto it. You have got good brush control because you're painting little dots of like a light catching on the lenses on the head and stuff like that. So you got good fundamental brush control. And even though there is some issues with the paint thickness and texture, what you blocked in is blocked in well. So yeah. So don't take it always like a negative. I think just learn obviously a bit more about your paint and you'll be fine.
JG Finch says, hey guys, I've been in the hobby and painting for 20 years, but I've always struggled to progress and improve my painting. My particular areas of weakness have always been highlighting and realistic damage. Here's a model I painted recently where I really tried to work on those areas, but I'd love to hear your feedback. So first and foremost, before we get into giving you a bit of steering on where to practice potentially and move on with some improvement, I just wanted to give you kudos on the overall kind of look and vibe of the model. I think it's really nicely blocked in. That's a particular pet peeve of mine, is when there's a lot of like bleed when like contrasting colors meet. So for example, on the shoulder pad here, where it meets the fatigues and the armor meets the cloth, it's really nicely segmented out. So I can read all of these as different surfaces. Exactly the same with the leather on the belt and on the weapon and on the metallics as well. It's really inherently obvious to me at arm's reach, what all of the different surfaces are on the miniature, and it's quite readable in that way. So I think that's really nice. But I think the main thing probably for steering, I think, would be in terms of the weathering and the chipping on the armor, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned that highlighting is something that you struggled with. Generally speaking, like the highlighting, the weathering, and just in general detail work and control all stems from brush control. And I think that's one of the things that, from looking at this model and sort of like trying to diagnose and have a look at some of the things that are causing some issues for you on there, I think going back to square one with regards to brush control is something that I would really recommend. You mentioned also about not progressing. And I think one of the things, we spoke about it actually on one of the episodes of Paint Perspective, the one with Logan recently, about in painting with intent. And I think it's really important that for mindset purposes of approaching this, you should be looking at the model and as you're painting thinking, I need every brush stroke to be sharp, neat, smooth, clean, controlled. And that mindset behind the brush really does convey in how you actually execute. If you're just painting away, not really thinking about the actual brush strokes and things that you're doing on the model, that's not going to convey to the best, sharpest, neatest, smoothest lines that you can paint. So I think probably getting like a base or getting a bit of plastic art and just practicing painting sharp, straight lines, little dots, little marks, paint shapes you're familiar with, so triangles, squares, things like that. You can probably paint them, draw them really well with a pen or pencil, but can you draw a perfect triangle with a paintbrush? The feel and control of the brush is very different to a pen. I'd recommend you do things like that just to really maximize your ability with the tip of the brush and the control that you put through that brush. That will directly translate to you being able to put marks, lines, little marks, highlights, all those things exactly where you need them on the miniature at the point of contact and where you're going to be controlling the brush. That's going to help you to make your weathering look better. That's going to help you to highlight better. And I really would focus on the actual brush control side of it before you start trying to do more advanced stuff on miniatures. Get the practice in, get the mindset behind the brush, and that will help you.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And then just to unpack that a little bit more, I think that once you've got that sharper, neater brush control, we can start getting into things like adding extra highlights and more contrast on things like the fatigues, for example, because to me, it looks like there's been a lot more attention and effort that's been put into the power armor than there has been on like the fatigues and the leather, etc. And then one final thing to note would be, this is more of an opinionated statement, obviously, than fact, but I think the color choices potentially on the orange for the weathering, to me, don't read as the most realistic they potentially could be. I'd have gone with more of like a metallic or like a true metallic rather than, it almost looks like a sort of bone color.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the intent is behind that. Obviously, there is contrast there. And again, if that's the look that you're going for, then fair enough. Obviously, that's an opinionated statement, but I'd have gone for something a little bit more like I would expect to see in real life. So maybe look up some references of like, shipping crates that have been like damaged and weathered and they've got rust on them, things like that.
Yeah.
Particularly ones that have been painted with similar tones that you're using. Just have a look at how that works, because adding some browns as like an undercoat, I think works really, really great. But then I'd have gone in personally, like I said, with something like a really, really bright silver true metallic paint and just added some tiny little chips with that there to the edges. And then, like James says, once you've got a bit more brush control, you can start going in and do some tiny little nicks and scratches, just to help sell the effect a little bit more.
100%, yeah, I agree fully on that one.
Yeah, but otherwise, I mean, this is by no means a bad miniature. I mean,
No,
it's really great to see. I think it's be wonderful for gaming as well and other applications. So keep at it, and hopefully those tips help steer you in the right direction. And we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Paul Nickel says, fresh off the back of the Essentials Master Course by Siege Studios in Stockport last weekend, and just finished off this latest effort. Just keep trying to improve and start pushing towards some competitive level painting.
Okay, Ace, Paul, you've done a fantastic job on this. A couple of areas just to fine tuning, I think, and these are going to be opinionated statements. Like I said, there's nothing that you've done that's like factually wrong. I just think that there's some things that could give it a bit more punch. So yeah, let's jump in and have a chat about the non-metallic. So the stuff on the top of the, I don't know what it's called factually, but the stuff at the top of the banner, I can see you've obviously painted that silver non-metallic. I think it just needs more contrast, being honest with you. So where you've gone dark, you can go a little bit darker within it potentially, and where you've gone bright, go a little bit brighter within it, and that will just give it more visual impact. Make it read a bit better, almost similar to what you've done on the faux non-metallics on the sword of the sort of like Grim Reaper-esque style guy on the banner. You got a lot darker on the non-metallics on that blade. I think that would work well on the other metallics. Overall, though, the colours that you've used, I mean, the red for the banner looks great. The harmonious purple colour for the leather or for the cowling looks great. Yeah, I think you've done really, really well. The sword looks good as well. I think the non-metallics on the sword have got a great amount of contrast on them as well, which again, you can then put that on the top of the banner pole. I'm guessing you've gone a bit less dark because it's at the top of the banner. It would still have a variance on there, so just go a bit darker and lighter in some areas. The base as well, really like the base. Me and George spoke about the base. It looks great, that tiled floor. I think I'd probably just glaze a couple of tints and tones on some of the little steps on bits of brickwork on there, just to make some of them a little bit more interesting than others, and just to vary it up a bit and give it like a bit more of an earthy tone.
I think as well, potentially you could just get a little bit of interest in there with some added elements, like a bit of a shameless plug, but the Siege Scenics moss pads I think could work really nicely.
They would look fantastic,
particularly on the sort of edges where the actual paving meets the kind of ground texture.
Yeah, and I paint that as dirt rather than paving. So then you've got a nice visual tonal difference on the base as well. Like it makes sense. You've done it like as like the finer amount of like rubble on there. I think do it as dirt as well. It just shows the underlayer of material underneath all those stones.
Yeah, and particularly in areas where like a lot of water would collect, and you've got a lot of shading from the sun as well, like underneath this step.
Yeah,
just some tiny little bits of moss powder or something in there would add a lot of visual interest. And if you used green, it would complement nicely with the red and the purple.
Correctamundo.
Yeah, but it's a really nice miniature overall. I really like all the color choices, even down to like the lenses on the helmet. Like everything's really harmonious and works really nicely.
Yeah.
I agree with James's points on the non-metallics. I think just even darker and even brighter. And don't necessarily worry about smoothness as much, because I think that's where you tend to end up with everything being very grey.
Yeah.
So like just get the main colour on there first and worry about the blending later. You want to go all the way up to white and all the way down to black if you can. And then similarly for the sort of the gold, like non-metallic kind of fringe, I don't know what you call that, around the banner.
Yeah.
But yeah, otherwise really lovely miniature. Hopefully you can just add those couple of little bits and we'll get you up to competition painting in no time.
Looks fantastic. Well done.
Columbo says, hey guys, thank you for giving me the opportunity for some feedback. This is the first model I've painted fully non-metallic metal, and the first one I've done not in the heavy metal style. I want your thoughts on the execution and opportunities for improvement here. And additionally, I would like to know whether this work has qualified for the competition level of painting in your opinion. What could be changed to push it further?
So I wanted to bring this up as Columbo has raised quite an interesting point in their submission. He mentioned about sort of competition standards. Your competition standard is the best that you can paint to. Don't feel that you have to hit a certain mark to be competition ready. Like you should just paint something the best you can and enter it and walk away once you've given it in, knowing that you've done a great job and you've painted the best thing you've ever painted. That is competition standard, whether you've been doing it for 10 years or 20 years or whatever. After that rant, let's dive in and have a look at Columbo's model. I think you've done a fantastic job on this.
This is wonderful. This is really wonderful.
Really well done. The non-metallics look really lovely, like really, really lovely, both in tone, in just in the value of like the contrast that's on there. The horn, I don't know what else to call it, but the horn on the head, lovely transition on there. It looks great. I love the subtle bits of detailing on the sort of like the sort of stomach or area with like the dribbles of kind of like rust and mucus and stuff that's on there. It looks great. Even things like that little bell that's just hanging down, the volumetric highlighting on the bell looks great. You've really done a truly, truly good job on this miniature. And I think, yeah, look, I would love to see this in the hand. As photo never truly shows the real finish of a miniature. The little red button, the power button on the scythe as well, a little bit of attention to detail on that is great. But yeah, I think you've done a tremendous job. Well done.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And yeah, like I want to see this in a competition. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one like tiny thing that I could, throw into the ring here would be perhaps some more tonal variants on the coppery sort of colours.
You can always push stuff.
I think a little bit of like verdigris or something, particularly
that
around
would
some
work.
of the sort of rivets and stuff, maybe at a push. I think if you are really really wanting to push this as far as you possibly can,
because it shows you're understanding the material then.
Yeah, 100%. I think just a little bit of like verdigris or something and corrosion, I think could be really nice. But otherwise, like the light placement is like really wonderful.
Yeah.
The basing is really interesting as well. I like that you've added like even down all this like spittle and things like that. You've got a pipe which is leaking here.
Yeah.
Really, really cool. So there's a lot of attention to detail on here. I would say, just chuck this in a competition and see what happens.
Yeah. If this is the best model you've ever painted, then yes, you are competition ready. That's basically it. So yeah.
Yeah, really great miniature. I think that would be the only tiny bit of advice that I could give. But otherwise, yeah, really, really fantastic paint job. And we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Alpius says, big fan of the podcast, and I wanted to give this a go as I've been pretty happy with my painting progress and want to push it even further. I'm looking for feedback on my army painting, especially since I enjoy that more than competition painting. This model is a standard Terminator inspired by the heroes of the Fist Company Ancient.
So we've painted a lot of armies, and the mindset that goes into that needs to be a lot different from what you do for competition. But I think you've done a really great job. There's not so much anything wrong with this model. I think that our feedback is only going to really be more of an opinion. But in general, I think you've done a great job. I think for me, to start off with, I think the highlighting is probably the thing that I would personally make a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more stark, increase the value contrast a little bit more, so that the highlights are a little bit more visible. If you can do that edge highlighted style, which in this case obviously you are, if you look at, like, for example, the value contrast on the highlights on the gun casing, they're a bit more visible. And I think that is kind of what you want to also do on the armor. In the setting, in the model, if the gun casing's got a slightly brighter highlight stage and it's defined, then the rest of the armor, which is also a similar material, it's not the same material as the gun casing, but it should also be as defined.
Bear in mind for tabletop as well, you're going to be viewing these models in poorer lighting and from further away. So you might want to go a bit brighter than you think, like that's part of the reason the heavy metal painting style is so effective, because even in dimmer, softer light, especially on the table, they look really, really interesting and detailed. So I would say, like, the edge highlighting is fine, but I think just use a brighter color, maybe one that's a little bit more saturated as well. I think this one's quite pastel-y, and I think it's kind of dragging everything down a little bit to make it a little bit less vibrant than it potentially could be. It's quite a deep blue. So I think just experiment with color choice and go for something a lot more stark, I think, than you have.
Yeah, definitely. I think the only two little things I'd add on, you've got all those like rivets on the kneecap, but then there's other rivets on the model, like for example on the thigh armor, and also the waist armor, and also on the tilt shield. Just paint those little rivets silver as well. We've had the color on the brush, so just do those. It just brings those details to life and adds value to them. And the last thing I would say is this is really opinionated. I mean, there's nothing to say the skull on the base wouldn't be the muddy color. I just think when you've got all these little details and things across the model, painting that skull in a contrasting bone color to the earth would look really good, and just define it as a detail on the base and add a bit of interest. And just touching upon the base, there's some material stuck to the base rim, which I personally just get your base rims as clean and as smooth as possible. Just really frames a miniature really nicely.
Yeah, you can just grab your hobby knife, and before you actually paint that black base rim on, you could just go around there and just scrape that nice and smooth. Bit of sanding sponge or sanding foam if needed as well. Because it really does just finish the miniature off, and I think things like that just break a little bit of immersion for me.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to clip that, George. You said black base rim. But no, that's great. I said overall the model's fantastic. Done a really good job for gaming. Transfers applied amazingly as well. Just to finish on that. So yeah, well done.
Yeah, really cool miniature. We look forward to seeing the army. Grimdark Seb says, been painting since February, and I've tried to put everything I've learned into this model. But I would love to know where I can improve, and also what improvements or areas to practice would give me the best return this early in my painting journey.
Well, Seb, for a painter of only a few months, you've done fantastic. I think you should be really, really proud of the miniature that you've painted and that you presented for us to have a look at, just to put that out there straight away. Color choices are great. Love the bone Aquila. I think that's great. Red gun casings, high contrast to black looks brilliant. So well done. Right. I think the biggest thing on this from looking at it is predominantly the edge highlight line weight. Now, there's some really good areas on the model where it demonstrates that you've got good brush control with the side of the brush, like, for example, the tilt shield. Those highlights on the edges are nice and sharper. But then there are areas on the model that do have a much heavier, thicker line weight where clearly the tip of the brush has been used, or maybe you've just applied a bit too much pressure with the side of the brush where it's sort of splayed over a little bit, or it's just put too much pressure and gone a bit wider the brush stroke. The biggest thing I can say to you that's going to improve your painting is to practice your brush control with both the tip and also the side. Get a bit of sprue, undercoat it black, get some bright paint, and just practice doing edge highlights on those four corners of the sprue. That will translate perfectly to on your miniatures when you're doing that side of the brush edge highlighting. And for the tip of the brush, you need to basically get a bit of plastic card, a base, or anything, and just paint straight lines. Imagine you're counting the days and you're not doing the diagonal. You're just going with line, 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 jump to another one, do 4 more lines. Do that over and over and over again. Increase the size, decrease the size, get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Thicker and narrower lines as well.
All that kind of stuff is going to help translate to better brush control, which then gives you the confidence of accuracy and precision when you then put it on a model. That's going to help you massively. All you're blocking in, top stuff, looks great, nice and neat, blocked in really well. That Aquila is super clean. So you're blocking in, fantastic. You just need to work on your edge highlights, both with the side and the tip, and you'll be smashing models out like you'd not believe.
One final thing I think, just to steer you a little bit as well, is where you've got your blocking in, it's nice and neat. Think about your cutting in as well. So like kind of negative painting. So if you paint a highlight on that's too thick, you could go back in with that base coat color and cut back in to make it narrower if you didn't get it quite right on the first time.
Correct.
So what you could do is go in with some black and on the top of the knee pad here, carefully just cut into that line to make your previous highlight stage effectively narrower. So if you haven't got the brush control to do that nice thin line now, you can paint a thicker line and then go back in, clean it up and try to get up to the edge of it. Exactly. You're effectively making what's left behind a little bit thinner. And then a tiny little bit of advice as well would be, similarly on the face, you could go in with the eyes. I think there's a little bit of a spill here onto sort of like the actual eye socket where you've painted the eyeball. The actual sculpt of these, the eyes are very, very, very small and very quite tiny. Narrow. So I would go back in with the flesh tone and just cut into that white. And effectively what you're doing is you're making it so that as if you'd painted that eye really, really sharply and precisely. You might not have the brush control to do that yet, but if you go back in with the flesh tone, you can effectively leave behind a really tiny line that you otherwise might not be able to paint.
Exactly.
But ultimately, that would be the best investment of your time at this early stage. It's just about brush control, spending a lot of hours, putting in a lot of time, and getting a lot of miniatures painted. But this is a really, really strong start, so we look forward to seeing what you paint next.
Well done, mate.
Well, a massive thank you to all of our patrons for submitting for this episode of Critique Clinic. If you would like your miniatures featured on the show and critiqued by myself and James, then check the link in the description to our Patreon. And over there, you'll also gain access to hundreds of high-quality PDF tutorials and new extended video masterclasses, which have tons of tips for improving your painting. Otherwise, massive thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.